Let's go ahead and get this party started. So happy Friday, everyone. I'm Jeremy Park. I'm the CEO of City Current. We're honored to have our good friend Michael Drake with us. For those who have been a part of City Current, you know him very, very well. He was an instrumental part of literally founding and starting the organization almost 15 years ago. And so I've had the honor of knowing Michael for a long, long time. My partner in crime, if you will, is a charter partner with everything that we did with City Current. Such an instrumental part of helping to guide the organization. And obviously he's still heavily involved. So we've given him an emeritus position, if you will. We love and appreciate everything he's done for our organization. And when you look at so many of the storylines in the book, The Bliss Journey, we'll talk about this, but they have a foundation of City Current, the relationships and the trust, and so many of the storylines are really cool opportunities that do tie in City Current. So this is a treat for us to be able to share both the book release with Michael, but also a big part of this journey and this next chapter that he's going on with his life. And so he'll talk about this third chapter that he's embarking on now with the book and speaking and consulting and teaching and inspiring many around the world. And so it's a rare opportunity for us to do a little different version, if you will. Normally these book releases would be in person, and he'd be able to shake everyone's hands, and you'd have a book in your hand and he'd be able to sign it. But this is obviously, given everything that's going on, our opportunity to still connect and to be able to share this virtual book release. So we do encourage you to ask questions. And so throughout this, if you have questions that you want to ask, go ahead and put them in the chat box. We have Allison Carson, who's going to help moderate as well for us. And she will make sure if you raise your hand and you want to be spotlighted to ask a question in person, we can spotlight you. And then that way you can ask your question to Michael in person. If you know me, I've got lots of questions. And so Michael and I can go on and we could do this for hours and hours and hours, but let's go ahead and kick this thing off with our dear friend, Michael Drake. You knew him as the founder and the CEO of Master IT. He is an entrepreneur. He is a leader. He is someone that is a passionate philanthropist and heavily involved in our community, serving on a number of boards. So he's a social activist as well, with deep, deep care when it comes to helping to mentor youth and working in mental health. And so he's got a lot of passions that he's heavily pouring into in our community. And obviously we're richer as a result. So he's a good friend. He's an inspirer of many. Let's talk about the Bliss Journey. Michael Drake, how are you doing, sir?
I'm grateful, Jeremy, and I just want to thank you and City Current so much for hosting this. Never done a virtual launch before, so we'll step into this and have some fun. But I wanted to say first, you know how it feels that, so many of our seasoned leaders and our entrepreneurs today just seem disoriented. How in the world can we lead when we don't know who we are, where we are, or what the destination is? And I know about that because I had a dress rehearsal for this 15 years ago. And we'll talk about that. But I was given a set of 14 principles that really have been a guidepost for me and my journey up until now. And so with this book, the Bliss Journey, Becoming the Hero of Your Own Story, I hope it will inspire and help others navigate on their journey so that they can either find or rediscover the power of their purpose and their peace.
You talk about being disoriented, and that's exactly what we're all dealing with right now. You have a global pandemic. We're dealing with both isolation and social distancing. We're dealing with a new norm when it comes to events and what that could look like in the future. There's so much uncertainty for ourselves, our families, our businesses. Talk about that, because right off the bat, as you mentioned, you're coming in a period of having to do a virtual book release. You're also dealing with some things right now with Google reviews and all sorts of things. And so you can't make this stuff up, as you say. But talk about, in the context of what you're trying to accomplish with your book, it really is kind of in a very odd way, good timing, because we need this more than ever.
Well, and I say it a lot, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, my business model was to publish the book and then go back into the industry which I came from, which is IT services. And, there are 50,000 IT service companies in North America alone, industry events every week. And I was also going to be speaking in the healthcare industry, because we'll talk about, my passion for behavioral health and my connection to Methodist healthcare. But I literally threw the business model out the window on March the 13th. So I'm pivoting as well, starting with this virtual release, and we'll just see where it takes us. I think I'm open to what comes next. And I think that's the most important thing. I'm trying to live in the present moment. It's easy sometimes to dwell on the past and think about the good old days or have regrets about the past. And it's also easy to let our minds wander into the future of what could be. I know when I do that, I get a sense of anxiety. And I also have that feeling of like trying to comprehend infinity. You just can't do it. Your mind just kind of breaks down. So I think the timing is good. I mean, if you read each one of the 14 chapters, starting with the introduction, which is the collective human experience, you can't make that up. So, this is really a story from my eyes, but it's about you. It's your hero's journey. And what I learned a long time ago is everyone has a story to tell. My story is your story. Your story is my story. And some stories may seem more dramatic than others, but it's very interesting how an individual story will relate to a unique other person in a way that maybe your story can't. And I think it's important that not only we tell our stories, but we own them and that we get in touch with them, because we're navigating very, very choppy waters. And we're all going to come out of this through this gauntlet in a different way. And I think it's an opportunity. We choose our attitude. So the timing, I think, is good, not for that intention, but I really hope that it can help people and not only inspire them, but to challenge them.
So the Bliss Journey is officially out today, and let's go ahead and back up because, as you alluded to, this is a body of work throughout your life and career in many cases. So let's start with the foundations. Like you said, 14 principles that came to you very quickly, and you were smart enough to write them down, whereas most of us, it hits us and then we forget, and it's like, oh, I wish I would have written that down. You wrote them down. So share the story of where this book starts.
Well, I was in the process of launching Master IT in January of 2006, and I was sitting at my desk at my home, staring at a blue screen, working on the business model. And literally, Jeremy, a voice just as loud as you and I are speaking today came to me. And it was originally 41 principles, and they were channeled through me. And as a songwriter, you know what it feels like to have something channeled through you. And I literally wrote with my pen as fast as I could. And I knew then it was going to be a book. I just didn't know when or how, but I didn't know how to go about processing that. And what I didn't know at the time is these principles I could distill down into 14 because there were many overlaps. But what they really were at the time was to equip me for the trip of being an entrepreneur. And as the audience knows, being a leader and being an entrepreneur is a full context. And I was about to go through a very difficult time. I had a dear friend of mine who told me, he said, Mike, remember this, everybody who's been successful that I know has either come close to losing it or has lost it more than once. And I got that close because I had to go 2.5 years without a paycheck while we were building up the business. And I got to the end of my financial rope. And it was really at that moment, 2.5 years into the journey, that I began to realize what those principles really meant. And then people started showing up in my life. Things started happening, I think because just my attitude and my approach to life started to change. And then Bliss really started to take over. And that's how I've been living my life ever since.
You get very raw with this book, which I appreciate. And I think in many cases, you see the external, the outside Michael that's very put together. You see you on stage, very polished and, presenting very articulately. But with the book, you do get very open and honest with what you dealt with your father, your life, your emotions, struggles with depression and things that run through your family, even very difficult topics like suicide. Share a little of that side of just bringing that out in the book and being very open and honest with what happened with your life.
Yeah, well, it was very cathartic to write it. It was like having my counselor sitting right by me. But I come from a long family history of anxiety, depression, and even suicide. My paternal grandmother died by suicide when I was 16, and that was 41 years ago. And back then, people didn't talk about it. We just moved on with life and pretended it didn't happen. And then I found out that 8 years ago, her son, my father, who I'd been estranged from for 20 years, had died by suicide. And my mother, a beautiful woman, passed away 2 years ago. She lived with anxiety and depression her entire life. And so the DNA deck has not really been stacked in my favor. But I had to be honest with myself to be able to navigate that, because I've been a very highly functioning depressive my whole life. And what the people who know me might not realize is I'm an incredible introvert. I'm very shy. It takes a lot of energy for me to even do things like this, or to be on stage to speak, although I enjoy doing it quite a bit. But here's why I enjoy telling the story, is I discovered, Jeremy, 100% of the time, 100% of the time, when I share my story, it gives other people the courage and the permission to tell their story. And because of behavioral health issues in my family, we never looked at it as a weakness. We just looked at it as an illness to be treated like anything else. And my daughters are dealing with that today. And I think if you ask anybody today, you go one layer deep in the onion, and we all have somebody in our family who's battling and dealing with this. So when you see me, you probably don't see the face of behavioral health, but I am. And I could go on and tell you stories that aren't in the book, having a panic attack on stage in front of hundreds of people and having to deal with the fallout from that. But the more I began to tell that story, then people start telling me their story and unpacking. And the cool thing about that is when that happens, we go from being human doings to being human beings. And this facade that we all wear, these masks that we wear, we're able to peel off. And when that falls away, we have trust that builds. And when that happens, we can have the relationship like you and I have been blessed to have all of these years, where we can talk about anything together. And it's so important now, because at this moment, we're all experiencing the same storm, but we're navigating it in different boats. And, some people are in really solidly built boats. You see people like our dear friend, Glenda Hastings, who owns Napa Cafe. She's got the weight of the world on her, but she walks with a pep in her step. You just can't take energy away from her. Well, the reason is she's become the hero of her own story, and she's leaned into that. And there are other people who are navigating, who are in leaky, sinking boats, and they don't know what to do, and they're experiencing the trauma and the pain. And I think part of it, and I'm not a clinician, so I want to be very clear about this. I'm just a layperson. I'm not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. There are professionals for that, and I really encourage anyone who's struggling to seek that out. And we'll talk about in the course of this conversation where they can go. But they need to address that. And they can, it's not too late, they can find or rediscover, or as Father Greg Boyle says, they can be returned to themselves.
Let's carry that forward, though, because I think that's a good point to draw on. Is this book, it covers everything from leadership and lessons, but there is a humanity and a mental health, mental fitness aspect. Share how you see this book, but ultimately, too, how this book is being presented, because already when you look at where it's ranking with Amazon, it's falling in some mental health categories, some mental fitness categories. It's falling in some interesting categories that we didn't even know existed, but yet it's around helping people mentally and spiritually, not just with their business and career and as being an executive. So share where the book kind of falls in that spectrum for you, but ultimately where it falls for Amazon.
Right. Well, as it relates to me, people are looking for hope, Jeremy, particularly now. And I think we're looking to each other. We're not looking for clinicians per se. We're all trying to go through this human experience ourselves together. But there's a chapter in the book maybe that might address that, and it's called 96 Minutes in the Morning. And really what that's about is I made a deal with myself 15 years ago when I became an entrepreneur that I had to take care of myself first. And I had to be not only physically fit, but spiritually fit, emotionally fit, for the journey, because I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I knew if I didn't have those three legs of the stool solid, that I would buckle under pressure. And so for me, as I said, being a highly functioning depressive, I really had to work on my mental and emotional side. And somehow Amazon has picked up on that, their algorithms, and have put us in some really interesting categories.
In a good way, though. And I think that's something that I do appreciate, the fact that in many cases, those who are the clinicians have a certain approach And then those who are just someone who's experienced it, who just puts it out in a real tangible way, can make a different difference and relate to people, because you're coming at it from a layperson position where it's like, look, these are the things that I personally struggle with. These are the things and the ways that I dealt with it. This is what's worked for me. And you can make it in a very easy to understand, digestible way, where in many cases, someone on the clinician side, it might go over your head a little bit. So I think it's actually a huge advantage that it is coming from you, and you do put a little bit of a corporate spin on it, which I think is really helpful.
Well, I talk to entrepreneurs all the time, and my experience has been we're kind of in a fraternity, in that you can tell somebody what it's like to launch a business or be an entrepreneur, or have sleepless nights over not making payroll, or wondering where your next meal is going to come from. Yet you have to go to work every day with a smile on your face and look put together, because your team really looks to you and they key off of your body language. I talk about that because that's one of my massive struggles, in that, when things would not go my way, I would be very rigid and stiff and bristle. And I thought I was a teddy bear, but I just wasn't self-aware of that until my dear friend Chris Crouch told me one day. He said, "You have the null face." I'm like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, when you are confronted with something unpleasant, we don't see any emotion at all. It's like Weekend at Bernie's style." I said, "Oh, you got to be kidding." So when I was kind of in a tough spot and fighting with the chairman of my former company, who I love and is my mentor, I took my family. We went to Universal Studios in Florida, and we rode the Incredible Hulk. And those pictures they take of you, and everybody's got their arms in the air and they're screaming and laughing and joking. Well, they took my picture, and my family was doing that, and literally I looked like Bernie, Weekend at Bernie's, propped up in the roller coaster. And I went, now I know what it is. So I said, if you see that ever again, slap that null face off of me. So I've made a conscious effort. So the reason I tell that story is, in today's times, it's really important for us to be self-aware of who we are and how we're perceived, because leadership is a lonely business, particularly now. I just, my heart goes out to business owners and leaders as they have to make very difficult decisions. And my favorite quote is from Max Dupree, who was the chairman of a furniture company. And he said, the first job of a leader is to define reality. The last job of a leader is to say thank you. And in between, the leader is a servant. And that's easy to say. It's really hard to do. And it's really hard to do right now. So again, in the book, we talk about that a lot. And each one of these 14 principles builds upon itself until we get to the end, which is, the last chapter is called Make Decisions, Accept the Results, and Relax. And that's what I hope we can do.
I know that Chris Crouch was signed up, so hopefully he's on and heard your story. He'll appreciate the little name drop. Talk about relationships, because so many of the people that you reference in the book, I know them personally because they're a part of City Current. You have people like Tom Shadyac, Tom Kalopoulos, Liz Murray from Homeless to Harvard, Javier Pena. There's so many of those who have become dear friends for you, but they have this foundation of relationships that you were able to build, obviously, through City Current, with all of us going through this journey together. Share a little bit, when you talk about relationships, share that side of this book.
Well, first of all, as I said, this book would not have been written without City Current. I mean, you gave a testimonial to the book. Manny Ahome, founder and CEO of Samaritan's Feet. Tom Kalopoulos, founder and CEO of the Delphi Group. You mentioned Tom Shadyac. Changed my life. Not only changed what I believe and how I behave, he changed my life. And because of him, I met Javier Pena, Ben Nimpton, Liz Murray, Father Greg Boyle. It just goes on and on. But and Jen Lil Brown, who's my collaborator in Nashville, who helped me write the book. So I guess it takes intention and it takes discipline in relationships. The great basketball coach John Wooden said, make relationships a fine art. And what I did in my time in City Current, and I'm still around, by the way, is I got very intentional with each one of our speakers, and that I would be their chauffeur. I would pick them up at the airport, and I would drive them to the hotel and to dinner, and we really would get invested that way. That's how I got to know Andy Andrews. We had a ball. hanging out together. He's America's modern day Will Rogers. And so I had the opportunity then to build a relationship with them and stay in contact with them. After Tom Kalopoulos spoke here almost 10 years ago, we had a historic flood in Memphis, and the Mississippi River came all the way up to Beale Street. And he called me. He said, "Mike, are you okay?" I mean, those are the kinds of relationships that we've built, and I've been able to maintain them. And I think that's the beauty of what City Current is. As you say all the time, a dollar doesn't change anything, people do. And that's a beautiful vehicle for us to have. But again, I'm just so blessed to have had those people in my life, and for the better.
What do you hope that readers take away from the Bliss Journey? What is your main objective?
First and foremost, Jeremy, I hope that they internalize the fact that they are the hero of their own story. And they have a story to share and to own, and it's okay to not be okay. It's the relationship that we have with not being okay. And I think we have to look into the mirror, particularly in these times. And I hope the reader can go through each one of these principles, which, by the way, they're not mine. I channeled them, and they're not particularly innovative. People read it and they say, well, yeah, I knew that. But when you put them together in a package, I hope that they can take it as a discipline in their life to either propel them to move forward or to be a change maker for them.
One of the things, which by the way, Chris Crouch says he's happy that you don't have the null face today. So congratulations.
I'm working on it, Chris.
So you're already making people happy. Is that you take them on the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is something that you really became in touch with through Tom Shadyac. And when you look at the movies that he makes and being able to tell stories through the idea of the hero's journey, it's a powerful way to tell a story, but you also use the Wizard of Oz, you use some symbolism. So share a little of that side of the hero's journey and the way you tell this story.
Well, I have to make one correction. I was actually introduced to the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell by Chris Crouch. We were in a learning group together 25 years ago. And Joseph Campbell was the 20th century mythologist, Sarah Lawrence professor, who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces. That was his magnum opus. And in that, he really coined the phrase, the hero's journey. And I really got turned on to that because this is the framework for why we tell stories. We're all wired for story. And it's a framework for how to tell a story. And when Chris taught me this, things really started to fall into place. So it's simply put, Campbell's theory is that a story has three parts, every story, whether it's a comic book blockbuster or anybody's life per se. And so you have an ordinary hero. They're living their ordinary life, like Dorothy on that black and white farm in The Wizard of Oz. And that's why I use this, because it's a very simple analogy. And then you have separation. That's the first part of the journey. So obviously, Dorothy's separation was the tornado that picked her up and sat she and her house and Toto down on a wicked witch in the land of Oz. The second part of the story is what Campbell called initiations. And that's when you go through several trials. Obviously, Dorothy's was to go retrieve the broomstick of the wicked witch. And then the final piece is the return. And obviously with Dorothy, the return was to go home. There's no place like home. But within the context of The Wizard of Oz, another thing that I really began to learn and understand and really embrace, and this goes back to your question about relationships, is the hero's journey is filled with what are archetypes. We're called archetypes. And really, they are just positioning of human character. And actually, if you think about Dorothy and her mates, Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Cowardly Lion, those archetypes existed, created behavior that already existed in Dorothy. It was there all along. So, and you also know that I say nothing, and I mean nothing is as it appears. And so with Scarecrow, he said he didn't have a brain, but he was really the most smart of all of them. Tin Man didn't have a heart. He was the one who had the most love in him. And then Cowardly Lion, with the name Coward, even though he acted very timid and cowardly, when it came time, he was the most brave of them all. And so these archetypes are behaviors that already existed in Dorothy. She just didn't know it. She was equipped for the trip all along. So it took this journey to bring about that in her. And I think the most important thing about the hero's journey is the return. So the hero in a crisis wins a victory and returns home transformed. Well, that's great, but that's not just for the hero. It's for the rest of the tribe. It's what do we learn in that hero's journey that we can bring back and share with others to help others. And most people don't know this, but obviously the movie, the Wizard of Oz, was made in 1939. Frank Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900. He actually wrote 14 different books on the Wizard of Oz. So what I want people to understand is life is a series of heroes' journeys. And so, Dorothy went on many other adventures. And that's what we are doing right now. We're all living a certain adventure today, and we'll live on to fight another day for other adventures. And so when I began to internalize that, it really helped my journey make a lot more sense, particularly when I was at the end of my rope as an entrepreneur. I felt so called to build this business, Master IT, but not for technology or to make money. It was just a framework to help people become the best version of themselves they could be. And so when I was at my most dismayed and disoriented, questioning God, you're the one that gave me this vision. Did you send me out on this limb just to cut it off? And then I began to say, you know what, if failure is what I'm supposed to do, instead of being a success, and I'm a cautionary tale, maybe that is the victory that I win, and somebody else can learn from that. And so I had to let go of the result. That's what I talk about in the last chapter. I had to be okay, or as Father Greg Boyle says so well, I have to keep telling myself, I don't mind what happens. Very easy to be said, and it's an intention and a discipline to do that. But when I started to do that, and I really embraced my own hero's journey, it really made it easier for me to see the hero in everyone else, whether they knew it or not. And so I've started to become an encourager in many ways. And I hope that's what I can do through this book and maybe the other vehicles that will come through it.
How has this book changed you?
Wow. Great question. Well, first of all, it was a cheaper therapy session than what I normally go through. It was very cathartic to write it, and it was great to zoom out of my life and see myself as a character in my own play. I'm entering the third act of my life now, and I've lived my professional life in two acts up until now. I spent 15 years with the Econocom Group and my mentor, Jean-Louis Bouchard, and traveled all over the world and just had an incredible time with that. And then I was kicked out of the nest, and I spent the next 15 years building and creating, the technology services company, Master IT. And now I'm hoping to spend the next 15 years encouraging people through the Bliss Journey. So that kind of gave me a framework in writing the book that way. The other thing is it really helped my gratitude to look back over my life and really understand the people that God has dropped into my life at the right moment, and to really celebrate these relationships that I have, even though I'm social distancing, that we can still have those relationships, and the value. And I talk about another chapter of the book, real friends glaringly stick out. And I give 3 different examples of paying it back, paying it forward, and paying it together. And just to relive those moments, to know that we're all wired to be together. And at my lowest point, I had people reach out and give me a hand up. And these are very humble people, by the way. And I asked their permission if I could use their names in the book, and they said yes. And so I want to highlight them because each one of them does so many things that they never would spotlight. I think it's important that we tell people often that we love them and we appreciate them and what they have meant to us and what they mean to us going forward. So it was a game changer for me.
So a couple things. Just for the audience, one is when he talks about being kicked out of the nest, that's a hilarious story in the book. It's not necessarily hilarious.
It wasn't hilarious at the time.
I was about to say, it's not hilarious to you at the time, but it is funny reading it now in retrospect in terms of where his heart was to really help you, but obviously a very hard lesson on your end. And so we'll leave that to the viewers to go and read that part of the book and see what we're talking about. But and the other thing too is, I hope that you're doing this third act for way more than 15 years, by the way. So
Thank you.
There's no cap on this. Share something that you wish you could have put in the book, but you didn't have the space to do that.
Well, maybe I'll answer it this way. There are some stories that I purposely left out of the book that I'm going to use in talks. And I'm going to share briefly one now because it relates to why I'm so passionate about behavioral health. Early in my master IT journey, I began to counsel with the senior pastor of my church with my wife, because I knew, even though I was optimistic and thought I was going to be a raging success, I knew my marriage was never going to be the same. And so we went and counseled with Rick Kirchhoff is his name. And
he's on here too, I think.
Okay, great. Hey, Rick. So we counseled with him. So he got a really good idea of what my business was going to be like. And there was a man in our congregation, Dennis Jones, who was wildly successful. He was the chief information officer at FedEx as they were, really just lifting off and growing into the stratosphere. And Rick introduced me to Dennis, because Dennis was a technology guy. And he said, you might want to meet him. He could be an investor in your company. He could be an advisory board member. And so we met one time, Jeremy. We had a 3-hour lunch, and I described my business model to him. And he said to me, it doesn't make sense to me, but if you want to call on me, from time to time, you can do that. And so as it turned out, he ended up buying a company, and he was in competition with me. And here I was broke, and I was feeling the pressure of competition. And here we were in church together. And so I can tell you, I had many thoughts that I was ashamed of. And then in December of 2009, I got a phone call, and the person who called me said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Sit down. I got something to tell you." And he said, "Dennis Jones died by suicide." And at that moment, I had another rush of emotions that began with shame. But you know my story. So, knowing my story, I knew what his story was, which, by the way, nobody had a clue about where he was in his life. And so that really started in me a journey through my own emotions. And to fast forward, Rick and I had lunch about a year later, and I told him my guilt and my shame about that. And Rick knew Dennis very well. And he said, "I'm working on something. I'll get back to you in 4 months." And I said, "Okay, great." Didn't know what that was about. And so 4 months later, he called me and he said, "Dennis's widow, Debbie, wants to gift our church to really create a Mayo Clinic of type for leaders and executives who are struggling with behavioral health. And they can't walk into their HR department and say, 'I'm feeling suicidal today.'" You got to remember, this has been 10 years ago. We've come a long way in destigmatizing behavioral health, but we haven't come far enough. And he said, "Debbie has one request." I'm like, "Well, why are you asking me? I'd never met her." And he said, "She wants you to be an advisory board member and a public spokesperson for this." So that's the kind of only God can do story. And I've been speaking in public really to business leaders about starting or reframing the conversation around behavioral health in the workplace. And it starts with the leader. And Debbie has become a dear friend of our families. The Living Well Network means so much to me. 10% of the proceeds of my book and any speaking that comes from that goes to the Memphis Healthcare Foundation, which I'm on that board, which supports the Living Well Network. That's a God story. And I've got more of those that I would rather just have a conversation about, because I think just putting them in the book probably doesn't do it real justice.
So let's do this. For all of you online, if you have a question, go ahead and start typing it out, and we'll do the raise the hand and let you ask. In the meantime, Michael, go ahead and read. You've got a couple of different paragraphs. I think for this, though, let's read the second paragraph, the second selection that you're going to read. So let's have you read that, and then we'll come back and we'll start. I see Chris already has a hand raised, so we'll come back and start allowing Chris and some of the others to ask their questions. So go ahead and read the excerpt, and then we'll come back and we'll start asking some questions.
All right, so this is from the last chapter of the book, which is called Make Decisions, Accept the Results, and Relax. You are the sum of the choices you have made up to this present moment. All the pieces, the good and the bad, fit together to create a beautiful tale. Your past decisions may have helped make you who you are today, but past failures don't have the right or the power to dictate your future. There is a bigger purpose for your life. Don't let psychological inertia rob others of the gift of you and your talents. I'm certainly not perfect. You're not perfect either, but God made no mistakes when he made you. You are the perfect person to become the hero of your own story. You can live a balanced life and enjoy the passage of time. You can live without regret about yesterday or fear about tomorrow. Make decisions and choices that are in harmony with what you believe not with the lies the world tells us about success.
So I'm going to ask one question, then we'll jump over. I saw where Chris had his hand raised. This is coming from Bill Piper.
Hey,
What
Bill.
are the biggest barriers to continuing destigmatizing mental health? How do you think people, so basically, what are the biggest barriers to continuing to destigmatize mental health? And then how do you think people, how aware are people of the stigmas that they might carry about mental health? Thank you, Bill, for correcting that so I could get it right. So what are the biggest barriers to continuing to destigmatize? And then how aware are people of the stigmas that they even carry?
Wow. Great question, Bill. I think the biggest barrier is fear of judgment. I think we all live in fear that somebody will judge us for a behavioral health issue as being weak and not having an illness like any other. We protect ourselves so much, right? We have fear of judgment. And the second question, Jeremy, was what?
How aware are they, and how do we destigmatize? So those are the two questions.
Well, I think the awareness is very low, because I'll give you a stat that we learned from Patrick Kennedy when he came to speak at the Living Well Network breakfast 6 years ago. He said by 2020, the number one workplace disability is not going to be cancer. It's not going to be heart disease. And it's not going to be diabetes. It's going to be behavioral health, anxiety, and depression. He was wrong. He missed it by a year. It was by 2019. So, that is the number one workplace disability, and we don't talk about it. So I think that will tell you that we're unaware, and I think we're unaware because we're afraid to address it. And there's some incredible behavioral health resources that are out there. And I'll just say, I talked about the Living Well Network. That is a part of Methodist Healthcare System here in Memphis. And you can go to thelivingwellnetwork.org. And it's a free resource to anyone in the community to help you navigate the difficulties in life. And when you go to that homepage, however you identify, whatever male, female, whatever, there is a section for you. And there is a way to get immediate help, either through a phone number or through being able to confidentially assess where you are, and then being navigated to where you need to get help the most. And that's one of many, many resources that are out there. So I think the awareness just comes from, I don't think we're honest with ourselves. I think that's part of what the Bliss Journey is about, is helping us look in the mirror. And I think my favorite quote of all time comes from Thomas Merton. He was a 20th century Trappist monk who lived in Kentucky. And he said, "Finally, I'm coming to the conclusion that my highest ambition is to be what I already am." And then he goes on to say, if I am to surpass myself, I must accept myself fully. And if I accept myself fully and in the right way, I will have already surpassed myself. So I take that to mean I have to accept myself not only with my strengths, but also my struggles. I mean, they fit together perfectly to weave together who we are. And if we ignore them, they're not going to go away. Yeah. But I think working on them, we first have to acknowledge them.
Carrying that forward, it just dawned on me too, is conversations that you and I have had throughout. A few of them that I think are really good for viewers on this related to that is with Ben Nemtin, for instance. We talked about reframing, and you were a big part of that conversation, reframing it from behavioral health, mental health, to mental or brain fitness. So in other words, putting it in a positive light versus something that already kind of has some sort of a negative connotation. And the other one is the impetus is really on those who are a little bit more, and I mean, healthy is such a vague term on the spectrum, but for those who aren't as struggling, to open up and help those who are, because the ability, like you say, to open up draws people in, to show you're only human, that we all have darkness with the light. This, what you see on Instagram and everything else, isn't the full picture of everything we're dealing with, right? And so by opening up, just like a songwriter, it can be very difficult to put yourself out there, but once you do, that's the very thing that draws people in and connects them to you. And so you become that vessel by opening up to draw people in and help them with that. I think that's where we all have to take responsibility of being more open and being more sincere, and yes, reaching out to others, but also too sharing what's going on in our world, so it shows them, hey, it's okay. I deal with this too, and I'm struggling with this too, and together we can make it through.
I think that's a great point. I mean, two things, and I'll come back to the fitness part because I love that terminology. But I found in my experience as a leader, the more transparent and vulnerable I have become, the more effective I have been. And the reason being is that it garners trust. As you said, people look at you and you go, I didn't know that guy, but me too, And when we can relate to other people, it's much easier to go together. And then the fitness part, I talked about the 96 minutes in the morning. I've got a physical fitness routine. I've got an emotional fitness routine and a spiritual fitness routine. And I have to journal, it's like that's my fitness exercise for my own mental health, just like cardio and lifting weights is for my physical health. I think they weave together, and it's like a stool. If you don't have all three legs, it's going to fall. And again, I think people just have to be honest and transparent, but there's also a fine line too. You can't put everything out there all the time. It's got to be constructive. And when you're really struggling, that's when you do need to seek out the help of a professional.
Right.
But again, I think that we are built and wired to be in community with each other. And the more that we can share, the stronger the bonds become.
So Chris, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You've got your hand raised. So we are allowing you to talk. You are talking now. So go ahead, Chris. Unmute. There you go. You should be good.
Unmute myself. How's
there
that?
There we go. Yep.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's good to see smiling face. Not that null thing that the temperature would drop in the room whenever we saw that. Two things. Number one, I want to really thank you, encourage you, support you in getting this message out there. As you know, I study quite a bit, a lot of different topics. A lot of books are superficial, but then there comes the books that you can't unsee it. You can't unhear it. So I think yours falls in that category where if you get this stuff in your brain, it's just going to work its way and do good things for you. I do encourage couples to read this together, and it makes for some great conversations if you're into a glass of wine or whatever. So thanks for sharing this and moving it forward. On the hero's journey, you mentioned that I had encouraged you to get involved in that, as I have many for the years. I just want to caution you. When you start exploring the hero's journey, the first thing you'll hear about is The Hero of a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. Don't take it on at first. It is really tough. It's really tough to read that book and really get excited about the journey. I would save it until later. Christopher Vogler wrote a book called The Writer's Journey. It does a really good job of putting it in plain English and equating it to movies that you've all seen. And so that's where I would start. And once you get heavily into it, then you would take on The Hero of a Thousand Faces. So thank you, Michael, for all you're doing. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Chris. And again, so many of the things that are in the book goes back to the foundation of our relationship that started 25 years ago. And he's one of my dearest friends and one of the wisest people I know as well. He's an author of many books, one Sifting. So I would encourage you, Chris, and have people take a look at that book as well.
All right, so another question. This is from Logan Young. What was the turning point in your life that made you realize money, career goals, etc., wasn't fulfilling?
When I lost them. I've had money and influence in my life. I've lost it and then I've regained it. And I realize it's just an illusion. To me, money is energy, and energy is meant to move. And as long as we have enough to meet our minimum requirements, adding another dollar doesn't incrementally make us any more happy. But I had to go through the tornado myself of losing it. And I hope other people don't have to do that to wake up to it. Usually we don't wake up to reality until we have a massive tornado, the loss of a job, the breakup of a marriage, those types of major life events. And when they happen, we're usually not prepared. And I wasn't prepared to have it all taken away from me in an instant either. And that's a hard journey, but it was very clarifying. I can certainly tell you that, very clarifying. And it's like kind of Chris said, once you wake up, you can't go back to sleep.
Yeah. Carry that forward too, because I know you and I often share this analogy, if you will, but it's something that Tom Shadyac says a lot about. Talk about nature.
Well, nature is the only system in the history of the world that's actually worked and has sustained itself. Every society has come and gone. And I think the reason that nature works is in nature, everything takes only as much as it needs, and then it gives back. So, what Tom taught us is, and he wrote another fantastic book that I would recommend, a New York Times bestseller called Life's Operating Manual, The Fear and Truth Dialogues. And in it, he talks about we respond to things in one of two ways only, either out of fear or out of love. And what nature is, it's a community of brothers and sisters. It's not a community of winners and losers. And I think what we're going through right now is exposing the fact that winners and losers don't work. And, Tom used the analogy of, the lion and the gazelle. When the lion kills a gazelle, he doesn't kill the whole herd. He kills one, takes as much as he needs. And if you watch this on National Geographic or anything else, the herd actually can stand around and watch. They're not afraid anymore. So nature has a way of cooperating rather than competing. And competition for itself is not a bad thing, but when we over-compete such that we have a huge gap between the winners and the losers, that's when society begins to fall down. And again, nature is the only system in the history of the world that worked and continues to work perfectly. I mean, look how even the fact that we're having to distance, how nature is coming back because it's not being oppressed.
Next question. This is from Jordan. What do you do daily that keeps you in the mindset of being the hero of your story?
Oh, great question. Well, again, I've got my 96 minutes in the morning. I'm a very reflective person. So even when I'm working out or I'm journaling, I'm thinking about this. And again, I'm focused on what my story, and this is not an ego thing, but what my story can do to help other people tell their story so that if they haven't awakened yet, they can realize that they are the hero of their own story and they can control their own destiny. And it doesn't mean you have to change jobs, careers, or anything. You can be the hero exactly where you are. The other thing that keeps me grounded and focused on the hero's journey is just my family. My wife and I have been married for 28 years. She's been my biggest supporter and cheerleader. Our 18-year-old high school senior is quarantined at home with us. And I'm watching what she goes through, what she's lost in this most important year in her life and how she's navigating it. So I'm trying to focus on her and be as encouraging to her as I can. Because remember when you were 18, the things that you thought about, your senior prom, walking the stage for graduation, and the fact that the last place on earth that you would ever want to be for any period of time when you're 18 is cooped up with your parents. And so that's what our daughter is going through right now. So I'm trying to see life through their lenses and be empathetic to that every day.
I can hear his voice in my head. We have Rick Kirchhoff who's asking a question. Another friend tells of the hero's journey as a situation, complications, resolution, and celebration. Michael, how do you celebrate?
Hi, Rick. Thank you for putting it that way. Life is to be celebrated. I try to celebrate little victories along the way. And I think the celebration for me really was writing the book. I mean, this is the first time I've written a book and I put something out there. And I hope that it'll further the conversation. So today, this is a celebration. I'm so grateful to City Current for hosting this and making it possible, and for all of you tuning in. I'm dressed up for the first time in a long time. This is a party. So I'm celebrating as we speak.
Yeah, all of us. Like Allison is dressed up. I'm actually wearing a collared shirt versus a t-shirt. This is a special occasion. Exactly. Next question. Michael, you seem very consistent and intentional with your self-care routines with mental, spiritual, and physical fitness. What wisdom can you share with people as to how to get to that point in our self-care? So many behavioral health issues fight against our ability to be consistent.
Great question. I talk about it in the book. For me, I had a financial crash. I began to self-medicate, so I almost had a physical crash. That was kind of the turnaround for me. And when I look back in that time when I was not healthy for myself, my family, or my team members at work, I think about that, and that kind of gives me not only the intention, but the discipline to take care of myself, because I don't ever want to go back to that. At the time when I was, by the world's eyes, the most successful in my career at Econocom, I went to Paris 75 times, traveled all over the world. I was at my lowest point, and I couldn't figure out why. And it was because I had not embraced myself, and I had really not begun to wake up to maybe the traumas that I had experienced earlier in my life. And when I began to unpack that, my counselor asked me a question that I couldn't answer for so long. He said, Mike, where do you think all that energy went? It went inside. And so I'm still working. I'm still a work in progress. I mean, really, I'm a work in progress. I'm working on doing those intentional things physically, emotionally, and spiritually to keep all of that energy coming back out of me so I can return to myself and be a healthier version of who I'm meant to be.
I'm thinking of one of the conversations you and I had before for the radio show on just you sharing some tips of the things that you're doing during this quarantine and this self-isolation to maintain your mental and your physical fitness. And that's taking walks and finding time to be purposeful with nature and relaxing. But give us one thing that we can do specific, back to intentionality, to help ourselves, and then one thing we can do to help others.
Well, so much has changed, Jeremy, in what the month since we had that radio show. What's becoming more and more important to me is less and less. And so I'm trying to throttle, particularly if it's one thing, I'm trying to throttle the news that I consume and how I consume it, because it's so easy to get addicted to it and get sucked into it and to find whatever you want to hear. That's another thing. So I throttle how much of it I hear, and I also hear it from different points of view. I am the most apolitical person you would ever meet. All I'm looking for is the truth. And so I'm trying to filter that through my gut. I think my gut tells me what the truth is, instead of, as I said, nothing is ever as it appears, nothing. And I think that's the most important thing I can do, and I encourage others to do. I mean, I take just enough news that I need to function and be aware, but no more.
And then what can we do for someone else? How can we encourage and be a light for someone else?
I think the best question that we can ask a friend, a family member, a coworker is, how are you doing? And if they say, I'm fine, I think the response is, well, you know what? I'm not fine. And it's okay to not be fine. Can we have a conversation about that? And then once you ask that question, if they're still reluctant to unpack, be vulnerable enough to share what's not okay about you. It'll be liberating to you. And again, when you tell your story, it gives other people the permission and the courage to tell their story. It's happened to me 100% of the time.
As we wrap up, go ahead and talk about, today is the national release date. So May 1st, it's available for everyone. So talk about where to get the book, your website, social media. How do we continue to have this conversation? How can we continue to support you? And obviously to help propel this book to number one.
And are there any plans for an audio version of the book? That's my favorite way.
You plug in when you run or what? Yeah. So, we launched number one on Amazon today, and health and fitness, and a few other categories as well. But you can go to Amazon and you can purchase either the Kindle version or a soft cover. We have a hardback version coming. We were going to do a physical book launch at Methodist Healthcare in May. Obviously, that's been postponed, but we'll have the hardbacks then. You can go to my website, which is the letter J, michaeldrake.com. And it'll give you a link to Amazon if you're not already there. And one thing I would ask and encourage is, if the book means something to you, I would love for you to write a review on Amazon, because that boosts the rankings. And I'm not concerned about selling the books. I'm concerned that this message, not my message, but this message can be so healing and helpful now to so many people. That's the only way we can get that out. I don't have a national platform to do that. So we can all go together. That's what the Hero's Journey and the Bliss Journey is all about. Let's go together. And if it means something to you, I would love your feedback. You can write me comments on my website under the contact section, or you can certainly write a review on Amazon. And I'm sorry, Allison, the audio version, we're talking about that right now. We wanted to see how well the book did on release, but I would love to do that.
So that'll be a next chapter. Allison has put in the notes or in the webinar chat his website, so jmichaeldrake.com. Also, you're all over social media, so that's an easy way to follow you and show your support. But as you mentioned, Amazon, purchase the book, write a review. that will obviously help you when it comes to the algorithms and making sure that this is noticed by so many others because it is a helpful book. Wrap up and just tell us your final thoughts in terms of just saying thank you to everybody for their support and where you want this to ultimately go with the book. So just tell us our wrap up.
Well, first and foremost, thank you. Secondly, if you haven't discovered it already, you are already the hero of your own story. And nothing has to change except you and how you look at that. And I think that can be the most liberating and healing pivot in anyone's life. It happened to me, and that's why I have been so passionate about sharing the story, is so other people can own their own stories and either find or return to themselves.
Well, Michael, you're a good friend. You're a change maker. We love you dearly. We appreciate your time, and we definitely celebrate you on this national virtual book release date. So thank you for all you do for writing this book and sharing it with people that hopefully this will reach people all around the world. We appreciate everyone for tuning in and being a part of this virtual release. Thank you for your time as well. Happy Friday. Enjoy your weekend, and let's support Michael. So thank you, everyone.
I love you. Thank you.